Somebody's getting better, and it ain't you.
33-year-old restaurant worker Joshua Webb is taking time out to be with his son.
Mom, Dad, that's my day.
Oh no. First.
When his son came along, he was really so happy to have a boy.
He was a very good father. He loved his son. He just loved everybody and wanted everybody to be happy.
He lived every day for that little boy, just like I lived every day for Josh. Everybody laughed, carried on. It was like, you seen one, you seen the other two. We was always together, working, fishing. We was always doing something.
Josh shares another passion with his dad, his love for dogs.
We had 4 dogs at the time. They was all pit bulls. And every time he'd come over, he'd play with all our dogs. All the dogs liked him.
Come on, what's up?
One of my dogs, Saki, passed away that day, and I was too tore up. His mom called him, and I could hear him on the phone say, "Tell Dad to come get me. I'll come help him bury Saki." He dug the hole, we buried the dog. I was tore up, and he was crying a little bit.
Thanks.
He would help anybody that needed help. Even if you didn't ask him, he was just volunteer. This is how he was.
Made me proud because the man he turned into be, he was a lot like myself. He just outgoing and worked every day to support his family, take care of his kid. He was just a good young man.
Later that evening, Josh heads out to buy some beers.
Back later.
Okay.
Where's your emergency?
Uptown Berkeley. I heard what sounded to see like a gunshot while driving through town.
Okay, we'll have an officer take it for you.
He's dead. He's dead. I think he's dead.
Sir, listen to me, sir. Do not touch him. Do not touch him.
The male appears to be dead, but the shooter ran inside. There's an active shooter inside the building.
We received a 911 call in relation to a shots fired incident. Our officers responded in anticipation of encountering an actual shooter.
Police respond to the Executive Manor Apartments in downtown Beckley.
Our officers had 2 jobs at that point. 1, to check on the victim, and 2 is to secure that scene and make sure that no one else is being harmed. They noted that it was a white male. He was face down on the wheelchair ramp. They checked him for a pulse and determined that he was deceased. They forced entry into the apartment building and began to clear floor by floor, looking for any potential suspects.
Police find no trace of the shooter.
It became evident that the suspects had fled, so we blocked off that area and began evidence collection.
What have we got?
A security area.
The victim was dressed in some pretty distinctive clothing. He had a bright red shirt on, black gym shorts, tennis shoes. He didn't have a wallet or an identification card. We were able to determine from just a cursory view that he had been shot at least once. There was a small caliber injury to his face.
There were no shell casings. Either the shooter did something called policing their brass. That's where they picked up their shell casings, or the shooter was using a revolver that once it's fired does not eject its shell casings.
Show me.
As far as identifying the victim, we have some patrol officers that believe that they were familiar with him. They suspected that his name was Joshua Webb.
Yeah, that's him.
Police find no eyewitnesses and no security cameras outside the Executive Manor.
We were able to determine that they actually maintained a security surveillance system in the interior of the building, but unfortunately we weren't able to acquire that footage immediately because there was no one there to provide us access. So we had very little evidence to go on at that time. But we hoped the footage from these cameras could literally crack this case wide open.
At the police department, minutes after the shooting, a witness comes forward.
Heavy-set white male wearing a bright yellow shirt. This was the person that I needed to talk to as quickly as possible. If we have an eyewitness account, that's a game changer.
The witness, Marshall Ratliff, lives at the Executive Manor Apartments.
All right, so your first name's Marshall? Marshall. Okay. Last name's Ratliff. The best thing I can tell you is, if you could just tell me from the beginning to the end.
Marshall spent the evening with his roommate, Angus Moody, and a new acquaintance, Joshua Webb.
When's the first time you ever met him? Tonight. Oh, this is the very first time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And who told you his name was Josh? He did.
Marshall indicated that a gentleman named Angus Moody had been staying at his residence with him in the Executive Manor Apartments for a couple weeks prior to the incident itself. He and Angus Moody and the victim, Joshua Webb, had spent some time just kind of hanging out together.
I guess it was one of Angus's friends because he showed up at Gomart and he showed up. They'd been drinking all day.
Marshall indicated that he was at the Gomart and he had a girlfriend that worked at the Gomart. He said that Angus Moody had met up with him there and had indicated that Angus had got in an altercation with Josh Webb.
At this point, they had a little altercation, right? Oh, there was more than altercation. And you're saying that Josh wanted to beat his ass, and Angus pulled the gun out, and he told him, he said, I'll shoot you in the face, Mom. I said, dude, I don't have no beef with him. I said, I don't even know it. Come out and made us all leave. Okay, she's like, y'all got to go. Y'all all got to go, okay. Including me. Which I get that. So what, at that point, who left first? We all three left. Josh was already halfway across the road and Angus was trying to catch up with him. And just interfering and trying to make people work together to stop.
According to Marshall, they continued on this path down the main street through our downtown area. They rounded the corner and actually ended up at the Executive Manor Apartments.
So, I left alone. I knew it was going to turn out bad and I didn't want to be alone. So, as I got around to the apartment, I heard pop. I walked around the corner and Josh was laying there.
This person had shot an individual in a very public area. Someone that does that is usually someone that's out of control. We considered him to be a very real danger to society.
I can tell you exactly how he shot him. Show me. Well, he had the gun in his right hand. Okay? Okay. He shot him up through the neck. He pointed right here in the gun. How close was it? Close range.
It's a terrible thing to think that that happened for no real reason.
And what did he do at that point? What did Angus do? He ran back in the building.
It was very detailed, the statement that he was providing, and the information was consistent with what we'd seen at the crime scene. But we were left with a feeling of there was something missing. So we knew that there was a lot more investigating to be done.
So that's the full story. Okay. And I came here. Well, I'm glad you did.
Investigators look into their prime suspect, Angus Moody.
We ran a criminal history check on Angus. We've determined that he was a convicted felon, that he was prohibited from any sort of firearm possession. So we obviously had real reason to be looking for Angus Moody. We believe we're looking for a very dangerous person.
Yeah, I'm gonna need a bolo out on an Angus Moody.
Got a phone call, and it was his girlfriend. Said that Josh hadn't come home last night, and that she seen on Facebook that somebody was shot and killed. I told her that I would go to the police station and see if it was Josh.
Hi.
To notify a family member that their loved one is deceased and that they have died at someone else's hands. It's a very hard thing to approach.
He said, well, you gotta look at a picture. So he showed me a picture. I said, that's my son. If you're saying a guy in them clothes is dead, I said, that's my son. I gave him that shirt.
There's nothing you can say. There are no words that are going to console them in that moment. There's nothing that you could say to make that better or even lessen the blow, unfortunately. The only thing that I can provide at that moment is my vow to make sure that they receive justice for what's happened to their loved one.
While patrol officers look for suspect Angus Moody, Sergeant Bragg heads to the Gomart gas station.
We knew that they had spent a significant portion of the evening there. We knew that the individuals had been involved in at least some sort of altercation, and according to Marshall, a gun had been brandished there.
Hi. I'd like to see some video footage, please.
The video footage on this case was going to be quite pivotal, so we knew that at that moment, this was probably one of the most important parts of this investigation.
From the time of the 911 call, you know the approximate time of death. You know what time he was at that Gomart.
You played around 1 a.m.?
There was not a lot of people in the area. It was a pretty calm night. We're looking for the altercation at the gas station to see if it corroborates the information that's been provided.
Play that bit again.
We see a male wearing a red shirt and black shorts. Same clothing that we had discovered Josh Webb wearing.
Pause it there.
We realized this is our victim. This is literally moments before his death. It was the first glimpse of our victim, Josh Webb.
Play that bit again. Why is he turning around?
As he was exiting the area, he was walking backwards. He was having a conversation with someone across the parking lot.
Zooming in there.
You can see a subject having a verbal altercation with the victim as he left the area.
And because of the witness statements, you have a reason to believe that's Angus Moody.
Play that bit again.
Marshall indicated to us that Angus actually pulled out a firearm and pointed it at Joshua Webb's face. From the footage that we had at that exterior camera, we weren't able to show that.
Do you have any other cameras outside?
We still had some hope in that we knew there was an interior camera.
Okay, show me inside at the same time.
We see the clerk working, who Marshall's reported in his witness statement is his girlfriend. She leaves the door to go out and speak with someone. Marshall had indicated that she had tried to run them off. That kind of added veracity to what Marshall was saying, because she did leave to speak with someone.
Who's that?
And then you can see a third individual, an African-American male. He comes through the footage and then moves back across the screen.
Slow that down.
He was wearing a very distinctive shirt, a navy blue shirt with bright gold arms.
Again, you have reason to believe that that's Angus Moody.
All right, give it a plan. Zoom in there.
A short time later, we see a male begin to approach the window. And as he gets closer, we notice that he's wearing the same thing that Marshall was. That is Marshall Ratliff. It appeared to corroborate some of what Marshall had told us. Just like he said, that he was at the store, had witnessed these things. Our focus at that point was to find Angus Moody. We were dealing with someone that was a serious danger in the community.
When the bolo goes out for Angus Moody, it is that he is potentially armed and dangerous.
We'd send patrol officers to areas that we knew he frequented, and one in particular was a girlfriend's residence. And that officer actually traveled through that area and spotted Angus in a vehicle that was passing by.
They were able to get Angus Moody outside and secure his person.
Angus Moody is brought to the station for an interview.
I'm Sergeant Bragg. This is Pinnell. That's Sergeant Pinnell.
We had this information from Marshall suggesting that he had been responsible for the shooting. So we anticipate some pushback. We didn't know whether he was going to be forthcoming or not.
I'm trying to figure out why I'm even here.
Okay. Well, I mean, that would be part of our conversation.
Initially, when I approached Angus, he acted like he really didn't know anything about why he was being brought in.
Because obviously, I mean, we're here for a reason. Did you witness anything happen tonight? Were you around anything that happened that would be a reason that detectives would want to talk to you tonight? Are you ready yet? Are you ready to get real with me yet or not?
Man.
Because we're at that stage now where we have to make that decision.
We told Angus Moody it was a suspect in a homicide. As we did that, his whole demeanor changed.
He admitted to knowing Joshua Webb and Marshall Ratliff.
How did y'all get to go for him?
Actually, me and Marshall's already at Goldmore. And me and Dude went to Sheets to get some more beer.
Okay.
Just hanging out downtown, just, drinking and stuff.
We didn't feel like we were getting the full picture.
But, I mean, I ain't lying, we did have an altercation and stuff like that. We was having an altercation and stuff. And I knew it was going to escalate. Essentially, that even Bush I never even seen.
I absolutely believe that part.
We know that Angus Moody has had an altercation with Josh Webb, and we know that some 3 or 4 blocks away, Joshua Webb was shot with a firearm.
This is not a question of bringing you in here and asking you if you shot this guy, okay? We're beyond that. We know who shot the guy. You did. The fact of the matter is now we want to know.
I did.
Yeah, we want to know why.
I didn't shoot him.
We want to know why.
No, I didn't. I didn't shoot him.
Come on, man.
I put that on everything I love. I did not shoot him, man. I swear to God I did.
Do you really think that's going to hold up?
I did not shoot him. I'm not going to lie about nothing like that.
I do have to admit that his delivery of those denials seemed genuine. And it certainly gave us pause to wonder, is there something more to this? We didn't know what footage we were going to have available to us. We did not have footage, obviously, of the shooting itself, but we knew that we needed to locate more footage and secure it as quickly as we could.
His mom didn't get home till about 4:30, and she was mainly the last one to find out. And I was sitting outside waiting for her to come home. I never do that. I just wanted to wait and do it just myself and her.
Just by the look on his face, I knew something bad had happened. And I asked him what was wrong, and he couldn't even hardly talk. He told me that Josh had been shot, and he was dead. I just didn't want to go on. How do you go on? How do you not have him no more? It was hard.
I really enjoyed spending time with him. I could have spent every day with him, which we practically did. Always had fun. I would just love to see him one more time to be able to tell him that.
Police searched the downtown area for surveillance cameras.
One of our goals is to find any videos from between the gas station and where the deceased was found. We have a general idea of the route that they took, but we didn't necessarily believe all of what Marshall had told us, and we didn't believe all of what Angus had told us. But we also knew that video doesn't lie.
Right. We got some footage here.
Investigators were able to obtain surveillance footage from an insurance office on Neville Street.
Discovered just after 1 a.m.
We hoped that we'd see our victim, the route that he took before his death, and also the actual suspects that did this.
What that surveillance footage showed was Josh Webb. Again, you could distinctly identify him from the clothing that he was wearing. He's moving from the Go Mart, and he's moving toward the direction of the Executive Manor.
Yeah.
You see him look over his shoulder, and he's clearly looking back. At that point, we couldn't tell what he was looking at.
Okay, keep it playing.
Approximately 30 yards back, you could see 2 individuals. And as they got closer, you could identify that one was definitely Marshall Ratliff, and the other appeared to be Angus Moody. There was nobody else out. Those 3 individuals are the only people on the street. You could see these 2 individuals clearly following him at a distance. And it was kind of eerie to know that that was just moments before he would to ultimately be deceased.
Detectives keep looking for clear evidence that Angus is the shooter.
There's another angle as well.
So the next angle was footage that they obtained from the Raleigh Playhouse Theater directly across the street.
Clearly see Joshua Webb wearing the same clothing, much better view of his face.
Let's see another.
You see Josh Webb look back and recognize that he's being followed.
Go back to the first angle. What's that?
It appeared that Angus was doing something with his hands. We couldn't quite tell what.
Good. Let's see another.
We're finally able to get a look at what Angus was doing with his hands. Finally, we have a gun in someone's hand. And not only do we have a gun in their hand, but we're watching them load it moments before it's used to kill Joshua Webb. Angus is actually loading the bullets into the cylinder of the weapon. So it really lent some credence to what we'd been told by Marshall. Everything that we had suggested that Angus Moody shot Joshua Webb.
We need to speak to Moody again.
Detectives try a new strategy to encourage Moody to open up. They suggest they have the shooting caught on camera.
You look very different than the person you were with, right? I mean, I think you could agree with that. You look very different than that person. Mm-hmm. So it'd be very clear who had done that.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. If it's on video, then I did too. I'm comfortable with that.
When confronted with the idea that video footage showed that Angus was in possession of the gun, he still maintains his innocence.
How can we get from that, where you had the gun, obviously, I mean, clearly up there you had the gun, explain to me from that moment to where this guy was shot, exactly every detail. His reaction was quite surprising, and from that point forward, he told a whole different story.
He comes over, and he's sitting over there running his mouth. All of a sudden, I guess the beer kicked in or something, because all of a sudden he started getting mouthy, so that's when I got mad. Him and dude is one who was having the problem, so it was their beef.
Well, it looked like you having a problem with
I know,
it.
but that's what I'm saying, but it was their beef.
The way he explained it was that this was an altercation between Marshall Ratliff and Joshua Webb. Marshall didn't like the way that Josh had looked at his girlfriend.
And she shot him.
Where'd you shoot him at?
I can't tell if he shot him in the head or in the neck. I can't tell. Because it was so quick. I'm on the side. Okay, they're right there. I'm on the side. I'm right here. You know what I'm saying? They're having their altercation up there and stuff, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just standing right there. And then Marshall walks down and says, let me get the gun. And I'm like, man, he's like, man, because I'm about to move this dude. Not thinking he's gonna scare him just for him to move so we can go in the building. He shoots him. And that's the truth. And I'm so mad about that. If I knew he was gonna shoot him, I wouldn't have gave him a damn gun.
That certainly changed everything for us. Now, obviously, we had some reasons to doubt that. It could be true or it could not be true.
Look, man, I didn't.
About where you've been?
If you got it on video, that makes me comfortable already. I know for a fact I didn't shoot him. Then it's on video.
Well, it is. And not only that, but
okay,
I mean,
there ain't no video of me shooting.
He became very adamant that we need to watch all the footage we can get because it'll show that he was not the one that actually pulled the trigger on this gun. So the footage from the executive manor became extremely important.
It did. The executive manor footage finally arrives. Joshua Webb was shot outside the building's entrance. The nearest security camera is only a few feet away, inside.
As you entered the executive manor, you took a right-hand turn into a little hallway, and the camera pointed at that particular area.
Joshua Webb had just been murdered some 15 feet outside, so detectives knew that at that point there was a very good chance that this footage could explain everything.
Yeah, it started at 1:30. Play that back.
Immediately after the time of the shooting, Marshall Ratliff entered the building. Angus Moody entered the building behind him. And it's a split second, but you actually see Marshall Ratliff lean back and hand something to Angus Moody.
Did you see that?
It's a very crucial piece of footage, and it completely turned the investigation on its head.
As we reviewed more closely, he was actually handing the firearm back from Marshall to Angus. And then they enter the building and get on an elevator. So the footage showed Marshall Ratliff in possession of the weapon that we believe was used to kill Joshua Webb, literally 15 feet from where Joshua Webb's body was found, and immediately after the shot had occurred. This one little bit of footage, this 2-second clip, it just changed everything.
Detectives knew at this point they had to interview Marshall Ratliff again.
Marshall had gone from a witness to now a suspect.
There's some several things that we've actually come across since the last time we talked to you that don't exactly jive with what you told us. That's why I need you to tell me what.
I'm trying to understand what you're sitting here telling me.
Okay. Well, the part where the shot is fired, because we talked about that. And you told me a very detailed story about that, right?
Yes, that's all the truth there.
Well, that doesn't match what we're seeing with our own eyes. That's the problem.
Marshall was extremely nervous, agitated, and visibly shaken.
I'm asking you to tell me what happened exactly, really, what happened.
I'm not understanding what you're asking me. You got to be.
Well, you didn't mention to me that you had that gun.
That was not my gun.
I didn't say it was.
So you're telling me I shot it.
You did shoot it. But the question is, why? What I need to know is what the hell caused Marshall that I know that wouldn't normally do that to do that. It had to be something this guy did. So what did he do?
When confronted, it was quite evident that Marshall's house of cards was quickly collapsing.
As we pushed further, it became incumbent upon him to tell us what really happened.
He shows up. What did he say to you that kind of...
Nothing.
Nothing?
I just didn't want, I told him, I said, Josh, I said, I don't want to hear it. I just pointed at him. I didn't mean for it to go off. That I really didn't mean to.
I get that. But I mean, you know when you pull the trigger of a gun, it goes off, right?
Marshall, in his original statement, he had basically taken the facts and just substituted Angus Moody in. He was really the person that had done all those things.
I'm trying to figure out what happened in Marshall's head. All of a sudden make you shoot
I
something.
mean, the way he was looking at my old lady tonight, I didn't like that.
You didn't like the way he was looking at her?
No.
Okay. Did he say anything to her?
Nope.
The one thing that had become readily apparent from the interview, through Marshall Ratliff's own words, he was the one that had killed Josh Webb.
Once Marshall had told his story, we knew it was time to charge these individuals.
Marshall Ratliff is charged with the second-degree murder of Joshua Webb. He pleads guilty and is sentenced to the maximum 40-year term.
He shot a good man for no reason. There was no sense in it, honestly.
I'm glad he got 40 years. I hope he never gets out of prison. He killed somebody, he needs to stay in there the rest of his life.
Angus Moody is charged as an accessory to murder and with being a felon in possession of a firearm. He pleads guilty and is sentenced to 10 years.
Had it not been for the video footage, especially that executive manor video, it would have been very easy to charge and convict the wrong person. And that's a scary thought for any investigator.
The video footage and subsequent confessions help build a picture of events leading to Joshua's murder.
Marshall Ratliff and Angus Moody got into a physical altercation with Josh Webb at Gomart. They weren't quite satisfied with how that altercation concluded. They followed Josh Webb through town.
Angus loads the revolver. He gives to Marshall. Marshall and Angus catch up with Joshua outside the apartment complex.
I think that it culminated at that executive manor. I think it became Marshall was going to show him that he was, the biggest, baddest one of the bunch. And I think in his mind, his only option to go further is to take his life.
I think Marshall Ratliff shot him because he was angry at him, and quite possibly because of how Josh Webb looked at his girlfriend. I think Marshall Ratliff willfully and knowingly killed Josh Webb in cold blood, and I believe that he doesn't show any remorse for having done it.
Marshall returned that gun to Angus after shooting Joshua Webb, and Angus disposed of the gun.
The revolver is later recovered by police. Minutes after the shooting, Marshall walks into the police department.
To come in and pretend to be a witness to something, accuse a friend of being the person responsible for taking a life, I consider Marshall Ratliff to be one of the more dangerous people I've ever dealt with.
Josh was just a good young man with great values, morals. Wouldn't take nothing that wasn't his. He worked for it. He just helped anybody do anything. I just miss the times we had when it was more just me and him going to the park every day, playing basketball, wrestling. So like two brothers playing and stuff instead of a dad and son. I just miss them times.
He would want me to be happy. He wouldn't want me to sit around and cry about him. He would want me to go on with my life, take care of his son. I'd give anything to have one more day with him. I was just telling him I'm proud of him, and he was a good man, and he was taken too early. That's what I would tell him. And that I loved him, and I still do love him. And hopefully I'll see him again when we meet up in heaven and I can put my arms around him, hopefully. I hope that's what happens.
has been shot and killed. We're standing outside and got shot in front of me.
You're standing in front of somebody that's just been shot to death, kind of like just try to take it in.
It haunts me to this day that I wasn't there to do anything.
He came running to my office and said, "You're not going to believe this."
In the early 1930s, Honolulu was a place where geography and power overlapped in ways that shaped everything from daily life to the administration of justice. It was part of the territory of Hawaii, still under strong influence from the United States, particularly its military presence. Beneath the surface of palm-lined streets and ocean horizons, there existed a deeply structured hierarchy defined by race, class, and institutional authority. Within this environment, tensions did not need much force to become visible. They were already embedded in the social fabric. It is within this setting that the case of Talia Massey would emerge, eventually drawing in multiple individuals and escalating into one of the most controversial legal events in Hawaiian history. But before any courtroom, before any formal accusation was tested, the environment itself had already set the stage for conflict. In Honolulu at that time, trust in institutions was unevenly distributed, and perceptions of justice were often shaped by identity and position rather than purely by evidence. The city was not isolated, but it was distinct. It existed at a crossroads of American governance and Pacific geography, where military families, local Hawaiian communities, and immigrant populations from Asia lived within overlapping yet unequal systems. The presence of U.S. naval personnel added another layer of authority, reinforcing a structure in which certain groups held more influence over public perception and legal outcomes than others. These dynamics did not operate openly as laws, but they influenced how events were interpreted when they occurred. Against this backdrop, the figure of Thomas Massey appears not as an isolated individual, but as part of the American military presence that shaped much of Honolulu's social order. Alongside him stood Grace Fortescue, whose later involvement in the case would further connect private family crisis to public legal conflict. At the center of these relationships was Talia Massey, whose name would become associated with an allegation that transformed into a broader social rupture. At the same time, other individuals lived within the same environment under very different conditions. Among them was Joseph Kahahawai, whose life, like many Native Hawaiians at the time, existed within a system where social standing and legal authority were not evenly distributed. His name would later become central not only to the initial allegations, but also to the subsequent escalation that followed. However, at this stage, these individuals were not yet connected by any public narrative. They existed within the same city, but not yet within the same story. The turning point came in September 1931, when Talia Massey reported that she had been the victim of a violent crime after leaving a social gathering. According to her account, she had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted by a group of men. This allegation immediately activated law enforcement response in Honolulu, initiating an investigation that would quickly expand beyond the private experience of one individual and into a matter of public and institutional scrutiny. Police action followed rapidly. Within a short period, several local men were taken into custody, including Joseph Kahahawai and 4 others. The speed of the arrests reflected both the seriousness with which the allegation was treated and the urgency created by the social environment in which it occurred. However, from the beginning, the case carried internal tensions that would later become central to its outcome. Questions emerged regarding consistency in testimony, the presence of physical evidence, and the reliability of identification. These issues did not remain confined to investigative reports. They quickly became part of public discussion. As news of the accusation spread, it moved beyond the boundaries of a standard criminal case. In Honolulu, where racial and social divisions already shaped everyday interactions, the case became a focal point for broader concerns about trust, authority, and fairness. The involvement of both local residents and individuals connected to the American military community intensified attention. What might have remained a localized investigation instead began to take on a wider symbolic meaning. Within this environment, the legal process began to take shape. The accused individuals were prepared for trial, and the case moved into the courtroom phase. However, Even before formal proceedings concluded, the case was already influenced by external pressures. Public attention was intense, and the composition of the jury reflected the social realities of the territory. These conditions created a courtroom atmosphere in which legal arguments were closely intertwined with perceptions shaped outside the legal system itself. The tension in the courtroom did not arise solely from the facts of the case, but from the context in which those facts were being evaluated. The jury was tasked with assessing allegations that had already generated strong public reactions. At the same time, the broader community remained divided in its interpretation of events. Some viewed the allegations as credible and urgent, while others questioned their consistency and evidentiary support. These divisions were not abstract. They reflected the underlying structure of Honolulu society at the time. As the proceedings continued, it became clear that the case was not moving toward a straightforward resolution. Instead, it was becoming increasingly defined by uncertainty. The combination of contested testimony, limited physical evidence, and social pressure created a legal environment in which consensus was difficult to achieve. The jury ultimately failed to reach a unanimous decision, resulting in a hung jury. This outcome did not resolve the case, but instead deepened its complexity. The absence of a verdict left a vacuum in which interpretation replaced conclusion. For those involved, particularly the family of Talia Massey, the result was perceived as a failure of the legal system to deliver definitive judgment. For others in the community, the lack of conviction reinforced doubts that had existed from the beginning. In both perspectives, the legal system appeared unable to fully contain or resolve the tensions that the case had exposed. At this stage, the case had already moved beyond its initial boundaries. What began as an allegation had become a public legal matter shaped by broader questions of authority, credibility, and social structure. The individuals involved were no longer seen only as private citizens, but as representatives within a larger narrative about justice and inequality in territorial Hawaii. Yet even at this early stage, before the later escalation that would follow, the most significant feature of the case was already visible. It was not a single event, nor a single decision, but the way in which an allegation could move through a society structured by unequal power and become something larger than the individuals directly involved. The system did not simply respond to the case, it was shaped by it as it unfolded. In this sense, the case of Talia Massey had already begun to redefine the boundaries between personal experience and public consequence. What remained unresolved in the courtroom would not remain contained there. It would continue to evolve beyond the legal process, into actions and reactions that extended far beyond the original allegation. After the initial courtroom proceedings ended in a hung jury, the case surrounding Talia Massey did not settle into silence. Instead, it remained active in public consciousness, shaped by disagreement, frustration, and a growing sense that the legal system in Honolulu had failed to provide a definitive resolution. The absence of a verdict did not reduce tension. It intensified it. At the center of this unresolved situation were the individuals who had been arrested and accused in connection with the alleged assault, including Joseph Kahahawai. Alongside him were 4 other local men who had been detained during the initial investigation. Although they were no longer formally on trial after the jury failed to reach a unanimous decision, their names remained closely tied to the case in public discussion. The legal outcome did not erase suspicion in the eyes of many, nor did it remove doubt in the eyes of others. Instead, it created a space where opposing interpretations continued to exist without closure. For the family of Talia Massey, particularly Grace Fortescue and Thomas Massey, the failure to secure a conviction was not perceived as the end of the matter. It was perceived as a disruption in the expected course of justice. The legal system had been engaged, evidence had been presented, and yet no final judgment had been delivered. Within this emotional and procedural gap, the case entered a more volatile phase. The environment in Honolulu during this period played a significant role in shaping how the situation evolved. The territory was still deeply influenced by its colonial structure, with strong distinctions between social groups based on race, occupation, and institutional affiliation. The presence of U.S. military personnel added another layer of authority and expectation. Within this structure, perceptions of fairness were not uniform. Different communities interpreted the same events through very different frameworks of trust and skepticism. As the days passed after the hung jury decision, the lack of resolution began to take on a different character. It was no longer simply a legal outcome. It became a source of emotional and social pressure. For some, it represented uncertainty. For others, it represented injustice. In this atmosphere, the boundaries between legal process and personal response began to blur. It is within this context that the situation escalated beyond the courtroom. The individuals involved in the case did not remain passive observers of its unresolved status. Instead, actions were taken outside the formal legal system that would fundamentally change the direction of the entire case. These actions were not part of the original trial, but they were directly connected to the sense of dissatisfaction that followed its outcome. Joseph Kahahawai, who had been among those accused in the initial trial, became the central figure in this next phase of events. Although he had not been convicted, and the legal process had not established guilt, his name remained associated with the allegations in public perception. In a society already marked by tension and unequal trust in institutions, this unresolved status created conditions in which informal responses could emerge. The escalation occurred when Kahahawai was abducted by individuals connected to the Massey family. Those involved included Thomas Massey, Grace Fortescue, and 2 additional accomplices. According to the established facts of the case, the stated purpose of the abduction was to compel a confession regarding the original allegation. This action represented a direct departure from the legal process that had previously governed the case. During the abduction, Kahahawai was forced into a vehicle. The situation did not remain within the boundaries of interrogation or legal inquiry. Instead, it escalated into violence. He was shot and killed during the course of this incident. His body was later discovered, confirming his death and transforming the situation from an unresolved accusation into a separate and distinct homicide case. This second event fundamentally altered the structure of the overall case. What had begun as a contested allegation and an unresolved trial was now followed by a confirmed act of lethal violence. The legal system that had previously failed to reach a verdict in the first trial was now confronted with a new case involving the death of one of the original accused individuals. The discovery of Kahahawai's death initiated a new legal process. The individuals involved in his abduction and killing were arrested and charged. Unlike the first trial, this second case involved defendants who were themselves part of the white social and military-affiliated community in Honolulu. This shift in the identity of the accused added another dimension to the already complex social dynamics surrounding the case. The case moved once again into the courtroom, but under significantly different conditions. Public attention was intense, and the proceedings were widely followed across the United States. The contrast between the 2 trials was evident not only in their subject matter, but also in how they were perceived by different segments of society. The first trial had centered on allegations against local men. The second trial centered on the actions of individuals connected to a more socially privileged group. Throughout this process, the legal question shifted from the original allegation to the consequences of extrajudicial action. The court was no longer evaluating the credibility of the initial accusation. Instead, it was assessing responsibility for the abduction and death of Joseph Kahahawai. This distinction marked a significant change in the focus of the judicial process. As the trial progressed, the facts of the abduction and killing were established within the legal framework. The defendants were found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. The distinction in classification reflected the court's assessment of intent and circumstance as presented during the proceedings. The sentence imposed was 10 years of imprisonment, representing a formal acknowledgement of criminal responsibility. However, the legal outcome did not remain static. Following the sentencing, political intervention occurred. Lawrence M. Judd, who held authority over territorial governance at the time, reduced the sentence dramatically to just 1 hour of imprisonment. This decision introduced a new layer of controversy into an already highly charged situation. The reduction of the sentence had immediate and significant consequences for public perception. For many in Native Hawaiian and Asian communities, It reinforced the belief that legal outcomes were influenced by social and racial hierarchy. The contrast between the original sentence and its reduction became a focal point for broader criticism of the justice system in Hawaii during this period. At this stage, the case had expanded far beyond its original scope. It now encompassed two separate legal processes: the initial trial concerning the assault allegation and the subsequent trial concerning the abduction and killing of Joseph Kahawai. Both were connected by a continuous chain of events, but each highlighted different aspects of how justice was administered and perceived. The escalation from unresolved accusation to extrajudicial action, followed by a second trial and political intervention, created a layered legal narrative. Each stage reflected different tensions within Hawaiian society at the time. The initial uncertainty of the first trial gave way to the decisive but controversial outcome of the second. Yet neither stage fully resolved the broader social conflict that had emerged. By the conclusion of this phase, the case had already become a defining example of how legal systems can be influenced by social structure, public pressure, and institutional authority. The individuals involved were no longer viewed solely through the lens of their personal actions. They had become part of a larger historical and legal narrative that reflected the conditions of the society in which the events occurred. The case of Talia Massey, which began as a single allegation, had now expanded into a sequence of legal and extra-legal events that exposed deep divisions within Honolulu. What remained after this stage was not resolution, but a further intensification of questions about justice, authority, and inequality that would continue to define its legacy. Following the escalation of events involving the death of Joseph Kahahawai, the case entered a third and decisive legal phase that shifted its focus from the original allegation to the consequences of extrajudicial action. What had begun as a contested accusation involving Talia Massey and several local men in Honolulu had now transformed into a second, separate criminal case involving abduction and homicide. The structure of the narrative changed, but the underlying tensions that had shaped the earlier proceedings remained present. The individuals now at the center of legal scrutiny were Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue, along with two additional accomplices. Unlike the first trial, where the defendants were local men accused of a violent crime against a white woman, this new case involved members of the white social and military-affiliated community in Hawaii. This reversal in defendant identity significantly altered public attention and legal dynamics. The courtroom was no longer focused on evaluating the credibility of a contested accusation. Instead, it was tasked with determining responsibility for a confirmed act of abduction and death. The legal proceedings began with the established facts of the case. It was not disputed that Joseph Kahahawai had been taken against his will, forced into a vehicle, and transported by the defendants. It was also established that during this sequence of events, he was shot and killed. His body was later recovered, confirming the outcome. These facts formed the foundation of the prosecution's case, which centered on the characterization of the act and the intent behind it. The defense presented a different framing of events, focusing on the emotional and situational context in which the abduction occurred. However, the core issue before the court was not whether Kahahawai had been taken or killed, as these elements were not in dispute, but rather how the law should interpret the actions of the defendants. The distinction between murder and manslaughter became the central legal question. Within the courtroom of Honolulu, the trial unfolded under intense public scrutiny. The case had already become widely known across the United States, and its developments were followed closely by national media. This attention added pressure to an already complex legal environment. The courtroom was not isolated from the broader social tensions that had defined the earlier stages of the case. Instead, it functioned as a concentrated space where those tensions were made visible through legal argument. The jury was tasked with evaluating responsibility under conditions that were already shaped by prior events. The first trial involving the alleged assault on Talia Massey had ended without a conviction, leaving unresolved questions in the public sphere. The subsequent abduction and killing of Kahahawai had then introduced a new layer of legal and moral complexity. The jury in this second trial was therefore not only assessing a single incident, but also operating within a broader context of unresolved public conflict. As the trial progressed, The facts of the abduction were established through testimony and evidence presented in court. The movement of Kahahawai, his forced entry into a vehicle, and the sequence leading to his death were not materially disputed in their occurrence. The central question remained one of legal classification. Whether the actions constituted murder or manslaughter depended on how intent and circumstance were interpreted within the framework of the law. The jury ultimately reached a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder. This decision reflected their interpretation of the circumstances surrounding the act. The legal system thus assigned criminal responsibility while differentiating the charge from the more severe classification of intentional homicide. The defendants were sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment, marking a formal conclusion to the trial phase of the case. However, the legal outcome did not remain fixed. Following sentencing, the case moved into a new phase defined not by courtroom proceedings, but by executive intervention. Lawrence M. Judd exercised his authority to reduce the sentence from 10 years to 1 hour of imprisonment. This decision fundamentally altered the practical consequences of the court's ruling. While the conviction remained in place, the punishment was effectively neutralized in duration. The reduction of the sentence introduced a new dimension to the case. It was no longer solely a matter of judicial interpretation, but also of political authority. The intervention highlighted the relationship between legal systems and governance structures in territorial Hawaii, where executive power could directly modify judicial outcomes. This action became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Public reaction to the sentence reduction was deeply divided. In many communities, particularly among Native Hawaiian and Asian populations, the decision was perceived as evidence of unequal application of justice. The contrast between the severity of the original sentence and its rapid reduction raised questions about consistency and fairness within the legal system. These concerns were not abstract but rooted in the visible disparity between legal judgment and final outcome. At the same time, the case continued to be interpreted differently across social groups, reflecting the broader divisions that had existed from the beginning. The earlier trial, which had focused on the allegations brought forward by Talia Massey, had already revealed deep disagreements about credibility, evidence, and authority. The second trial, while legally distinct, was inseparable from this earlier context. Together, the two cases formed a continuous sequence of events that exposed underlying structural tensions in Honolulu society. The individuals involved were now permanently associated with this sequence. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue were no longer seen solely through the lens of family involvement in a personal crisis. They had become central figures in a legal case that extended beyond individual circumstances and into broader questions of justice and authority. Similarly, Joseph Kahahawai became the focal point of a separate but connected legal outcome that reshaped public perception of the entire sequence of events. In the aftermath of the trial and sentence reduction, the case became embedded in discussions about law, race, and power in Honolulu. It was no longer treated as a single legal matter, but as a series of interconnected events that revealed inconsistencies in how justice was applied and perceived. The presence of military influence, social hierarchy, and political authority all contributed to the complexity of interpretation. The final stage of this phase did not resolve these tensions. Instead, it left them as part of the case's enduring legacy. The legal system had produced a verdict, imposed a sentence, and then witnessed that sentence being effectively nullified through executive action. Each step was procedurally valid within its own framework, yet collectively they produced a result that continued to generate controversy. By the end of this stage, the case had fully transitioned from a localized criminal investigation into a historical example of legal and social conflict. The events surrounding Talia Massey and the death of Joseph Kahahawai were now inseparable from broader discussions about justice, inequality, and institutional authority in early 20th century Hawaii. What remained was not a single unresolved question, but a layered sequence of legal outcomes that continued to be interpreted differently, depending on perspective. The courtroom had concluded its role, but the meaning of its decisions continued to evolve beyond it. Following the conclusion of the manslaughter trial and the unprecedented reduction of sentence by Lawrence M. Judd, the Massey case did not fade into resolution. Instead, it became a reference point for ongoing discussions about law enforcement, judicial authority, and racial tension in Honolulu. While the courtroom phase had formally ended, the case continued to exist in public consciousness as a deeply divisive sequence of events whose meaning was still being actively interpreted. At the center of this extended aftermath remained the individuals whose lives had been permanently altered by the case. Talia Massey remained associated with the original allegation that had triggered the entire chain of events. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue remained linked to the subsequent abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai. Although the legal system had completed its formal processes, the social and historical consequences of those actions continued to develop in public discourse. The investigation phase of the case, when viewed in isolation, appears relatively straightforward in structure. After the initial allegation was reported, law enforcement in Honolulu quickly detained multiple suspects, including Kahahawai and 4 others. The investigation focused on establishing whether the alleged assault had occurred and whether the accused individuals were responsible. However, from the beginning, the case was marked by evidentiary challenges. The testimony provided by Talia Massey contained inconsistencies as documented in the case record, and the physical evidence available was not sufficient to definitively resolve the competing claims. These limitations had a direct impact on the legal proceedings. Without strong physical evidence, the prosecution relied heavily on testimonial accounts and identification procedures. The defense, in turn, challenged the reliability of those accounts. This evidentiary imbalance contributed to the inability of the jury to reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a hung jury. The failure to reach consensus did not establish innocence or guilt. It simply reflected the inability of the available evidence to meet the threshold required for conviction. In the immediate aftermath of this outcome, the case entered a period of heightened instability. The absence of a verdict created a vacuum in which competing interpretations of the events continued to circulate. For some members of the community, particularly those aligned with the Massey family's perspective, the lack of conviction was perceived as a failure of the justice system. For others, particularly within Native Hawaiian and Asian communities, the unresolved verdict reinforced concerns about bias and unequal treatment within legal institutions. This divergence in perception played a significant role in shaping what occurred next. The transition from courtroom proceedings to extrajudicial action did not occur in isolation from the earlier trial. Instead, it emerged directly from the unresolved status of the case. The abduction of Kahahawai by Thomas Massey, Grace Fortescue, and 2 additional accomplices was framed by those involved as an attempt to obtain a confession. However, within the legal framework, this action constituted a separate criminal offense. The investigation into Kahahawai's death confirmed that he had been forcibly taken and killed during this incident. The evidentiary record established the sequence of events leading to his death, which became the basis for the second prosecution. Unlike the first trial, where the central question was whether a crime had occurred and who was responsible, this second case involved a set of facts that were largely undisputed in terms of occurrence. The legal question instead centered on classification and intent. During the second trial, prosecutors presented the established sequence of abduction and death as evidence of criminal responsibility. The defense argued that the context of the actions should be considered in evaluating intent. The jury, tasked with interpreting these arguments within the legal framework, ultimately returned a verdict of manslaughter. This classification reflected a legal distinction between intentional homicide and a lesser degree of culpability based on circumstances. The sentencing phase resulted in a 10-year imprisonment term for the defendants. However, this outcome was immediately followed by executive intervention. Governor Lawrence M. Judd exercised his authority to reduce the sentence to 1 hour of imprisonment. This action did not overturn the conviction but effectively eliminated its practical consequences. The legal judgment remained recorded, but its enforcement was dramatically altered. This intervention became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. It highlighted the interaction between judicial decisions and executive authority within the territorial governance structure of Hawaii at the time. While the court had reached a conclusion based on legal reasoning and evidence, the final outcome experienced modification through political discretion. This created a tension between the formal independence of the judiciary and the practical influence of executive power. The public response to these developments varied significantly across different communities. In many Native Hawaiian and Asian communities, the reduction of the sentence was interpreted as evidence of systemic inequality. The perception that social status and racial identity could influence legal outcomes contributed to a broader sense of mistrust in institutional fairness. In contrast, other segments of society viewed the case through different interpretive frameworks shaped by the initial allegation and the emotional context surrounding it. These conflicting interpretations ensured that the case remained a subject of discussion long after the legal proceedings had concluded. It became part of a broader historical narrative about justice in territorial Hawaii, where questions of race, authority, and legal consistency were already deeply embedded in social structure. The Massey case did not create these tensions, but it exposed and intensified them in a highly visible way. From an investigative perspective, the case also illustrates the limitations of early 20th century criminal procedure in complex, socially charged environments. The initial investigation was constrained by the available evidence, which included testimonial inconsistencies and limited physical corroboration. The absence of definitive forensic tools meant that resolution depended heavily on interpretive judgment, both within the investigative process and during the trial. Once the case transitioned into its second phase involving the abduction and death of Kahahawai, the investigative focus shifted from establishing guilt in an alleged assault to documenting responsibility for a confirmed homicide. This shift simplified certain aspects of the evidentiary structure while intensifying the legal and moral implications of the case. The clarity of the physical outcome contrasted sharply with the ambiguity of intent and classification. Throughout both phases, the case demonstrated how legal systems operate within broader social contexts. The courtroom did not function in isolation from public perception, institutional authority, or historical tension. Instead, it operated within a network of influences that shaped how evidence was interpreted and how outcomes were received. By the conclusion of all legal proceedings, the case had developed into a layered historical event with multiple points of legal resolution, but no single point of social consensus. The initial allegation remained contested in public memory, the first trial remained unresolved in terms of conviction, and the second trial concluded with a verdict that was subsequently altered in practical effect through political intervention. The individuals involved were left permanently associated with these outcomes. Talia Massey remained linked to the initiating allegation. Joseph Kahahawai remained identified as the victim of the subsequent homicide. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue remained associated with both the legal conviction and the political reduction of sentence that followed. In the absence of further legal development, the case transitioned fully into historical record. Its significance persisted not through ongoing investigation, but through continued analysis of what it revealed about justice, authority, and social structure in Honolulu during this period. Following the conclusion of the second trial and the highly controversial sentence reduction ordered by Lawrence M. Judd, the Massey case entered its final legal phase, where formal judicial processes had effectively ended. But the consequences of those processes continued to resonate across Honolulu and beyond. The courtroom had already delivered its verdict in the case involving the death of Joseph Kahahawai, but what followed was not closure in the emotional or social sense. Instead, it was a period in which the meaning of that verdict became the subject of intense public interpretation. The defendants, Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue, along with their two accomplices, had been formally convicted of manslaughter. This legal classification confirmed that the court recognized criminal responsibility for the abduction and killing of Kahahawai. The evidence presented during the trial had established the sequence of events, including the forced removal of Kahahawai, the transportation by vehicle, and his subsequent death by gunfire. These facts were not in dispute during the proceedings. The central legal question had been the interpretation of intent and the appropriate classification of the crime. The jury's decision to return a manslaughter verdict rather than a murder conviction reflected the legal distinction between levels of culpability. Within the framework of the court, This meant that while the defendants were found responsible for causing death, the specific legal threshold required for murder was not met according to the jury's interpretation of the evidence. This distinction was critical in shaping the sentencing phase of the trial. The original sentence imposed by the court was 10 years of imprisonment. This sentence represented the judiciary's formal recognition of the seriousness of the offense. However, this judicial determination did not remain the final practical outcome. The intervention by Governor Lawrence M. Judd altered the enforcement of the sentence in a way that significantly changed its impact. By reducing the sentence to 1 hour, the governor exercised executive authority over the judicial outcome, a decision that immediately became a focal point of public controversy. The reduction of the sentence did not erase the conviction, but it effectively neutralized the punitive consequence of the court's decision. This created a situation in which the legal record indicated guilt and sentencing, while the practical enforcement of that sentence suggested minimal consequence. The coexistence of these two outcomes became central to public debate about the fairness and consistency of the justice system in territorial Hawaii. In many communities, particularly among Native Hawaiian and Asian populations, the sentence reduction was interpreted as evidence of systemic imbalance. The perception that individuals connected to social and military elites could receive substantially reduced punishment reinforced existing concerns about unequal treatment under the law. These concerns were not new to the case, but they became more pronounced in the aftermath of the governor's decision. The case had already been deeply shaped by social divisions during its earlier stages. The initial allegation made by Talia Massey had been processed within a legal environment that was already influenced by racial and institutional hierarchies. The first trial, which ended in a hung jury, had revealed how difficult it was to reach consensus in a case where public perception was already divided. The second trial, while legally clearer in terms of factual outcome, did not resolve these underlying tensions. Instead, it shifted the focus from the credibility of an allegation to the consequences of a retaliatory act. The killing of Kahahawai had transformed the case from a disputed assault accusation into a confirmed homicide case with identifiable perpetrators. Yet even this apparent clarity did not produce social consensus. The interpretation of responsibility, justice, and proportionality remained contested. Within the legal system, the case was formally concluded after the sentence reduction. There were no further trials, no additional charges, and no reopened proceedings. The judicial process had reached its endpoint. However, the absence of further legal action did not correspond to the absence of public reaction. Instead, the case continued to circulate in public discourse as an example of how legal outcomes could be shaped by factors beyond courtroom evidence. The individuals involved remained central to this ongoing interpretation. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue were no longer active participants in legal proceedings, but their actions continued to define how the case was understood. The same was true for Joseph Kahahawai, whose death became a focal point for discussions about justice and accountability. The case also influenced broader perceptions of the relationship between military presence, governance, and local populations in Honolulu. The involvement of individuals connected to military and social elites highlighted how institutional proximity could intersect with legal outcomes. While the court operated within formal legal structures, the surrounding social context shaped how those structures were perceived and interpreted. In the aftermath of the trial, the case became embedded in public memory not as a single event, but as a sequence of interconnected legal and extra-legal actions. The initial allegation, the hung jury, the abduction and killing, the manslaughter conviction, and the sentence reduction all became part of a continuous narrative. Each stage influenced the next, creating a layered structure that resisted simple interpretation. From a legal perspective, the case is often cited as an example of how criminal justice systems can be affected by external pressures, including social identity, public opinion, and executive authority. The formal processes of law were followed in both trials, but the outcomes demonstrated how those processes can be interpreted differently depending on the broader context in which they occur. The Massey case also illustrates the distinction between legal resolution and social resolution. Legally, the case reached its conclusion with a conviction and sentencing, followed by executive modification. Socially, however, the case remained unresolved in terms of consensus. Different communities continued to interpret the events through different frameworks, and no single narrative achieved universal acceptance. The presence of competing interpretations ensured that the case maintained relevance beyond its immediate historical moment. It became part of broader discussions about justice in Hawaii during the early 20th century, particularly in relation to race, authority, and institutional legitimacy. These discussions extended beyond the individuals directly involved and into wider considerations of how legal systems function in socially stratified environments. The final legal outcome did not resolve these broader questions. Instead, it highlighted them. The conviction for manslaughter established formal responsibility for the death of Kahahawai, but the subsequent reduction of sentence raised questions about the consistency and neutrality of legal enforcement. These dual outcomes coexisted within the same case, creating a complex legacy that continues to be analyzed. By the end of the legal process, there were no remaining judicial actions to be taken. The case had reached its procedural conclusion. However, its significance did not end with a final court decision. It continued to exist as a reference point for examining the interaction between law, society, and power in territorial Hawaii. The individuals involved, particularly Talia Massey, Thomas Massey, Grace Fortescue, and Joseph Kahahawai, remained permanently associated with this sequence of events. Their roles within the case were defined not only by their actions, but also by the legal and social interpretations that followed those actions. The Massey trial ultimately stands as a completed legal process with an unresolved social legacy. Its final court outcome closed the procedural file, but it did not close the broader questions it raised about justice, authority, and inequality in Honolulu. In the final assessment of the Massey trial of 1931, what remains is not a single moment of resolution, but a layered sequence of legal outcomes and social consequences that continued to reverberate long after the courtroom proceedings ended in Honolulu. The case involving Talia Massey, her husband Thomas Massey, her mother Grace Fortescue, and Joseph Kahahawai became more than a criminal matter. It evolved into a defining historical reference point for discussions of justice, authority, and racial inequality in territorial Hawaii. The legal record itself is clear in structure. It began with an allegation of sexual assault made by Talia Massey. It proceeded through arrests of multiple local men, including Kahahawai. It moved into a trial that ended without a unanimous verdict. It escalated into the abduction and killing of Kahahawai by members of the Massey family circle. It concluded with a manslaughter conviction and a dramatically reduced sentence imposed by Governor Lawrence M. Judd. Each stage is documented, each outcome recorded, yet the overall meaning of these events remains contested in interpretation. From a strictly procedural standpoint, the case demonstrates how a criminal investigation can progress through multiple phases without producing a unified sense of closure. The first phase, centered on the allegation itself, was characterized by evidentiary uncertainty. The second phase, the trial of the accused local men, ended without conviction due to a hung jury. The third phase, involving the killing of Kahahawai, produced a clear legal finding of manslaughter. The fourth and final phase, the sentencing and its reduction, introduced a political dimension that altered the practical consequences of judicial decision-making. The presence of these distinct phases highlights the complexity of legal systems operating within socially divided environments. In this case, the legal process was not isolated from the broader structure of society in Hawaii at the time. Instead, it was embedded within a framework shaped by race, class, and institutional authority. The involvement of U.S. military personnel, the position of local Hawaiian communities, and the influence of social elites all contributed to the environment in which the case unfolded. The perception of justice varied significantly across these groups. For some, the initial failure to secure a conviction in the first trial represented a breakdown of legal certainty. For others, it reflected deeper concerns about bias and evidentiary insufficiency. The subsequent extrajudicial actions taken against Kahahawai were interpreted in similarly divergent ways, depending on the social and cultural perspective of observers. These differences did not resolve through the legal process. Instead, They persisted and were amplified by the outcomes of each stage. The final legal outcome, the manslaughter conviction followed by sentence reduction, created a particularly complex situation. On one level, the court had established criminal responsibility for the death of Kahahawai. On another level, the executive decision to reduce the sentence to a nominal duration effectively minimized the practical consequences of that responsibility. This duality between formal judgment and practical enforcement became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. In examining the long-term impact of the Massey trial, it is important to distinguish between legal finality and historical interpretation. Legally, the case concluded with no further appeals, no additional prosecutions, and no reopening of proceedings. The judicial system reached its endpoint. However, historically and socially, the case continued to function as a reference point for analyzing the interaction between law and power. The individuals involved remained central to this ongoing interpretation. Talia Massey remained associated with the initiating allegation that set the entire sequence in motion. Joseph Kahahawai remained the figure whose death marked the transition from disputed accusation to confirmed homicide. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue remained linked to both the abduction and the subsequent legal consequences. Their roles became fixed within the historical record, not as evolving participants, but as defined positions within a completed sequence of events. The broader implications of the case extend into discussions of institutional trust and the perception of justice in environments marked by inequality. The case illustrates how legal systems can be influenced not only by evidence and procedure, but also by social context and external pressure. The jury's inability to reach a verdict in the first trial reflected evidentiary limitations, but it also occurred within a socially charged environment. The second trial, while more definitive in its factual findings, was followed by executive intervention that altered its practical outcome. These dynamics contribute to the case's enduring significance. It is frequently referenced in discussions of how justice systems operate under conditions of social stratification. The Massey trial is not remembered solely for its individual events, but for the way those events interacted with broader structures of authority and perception in Honolulu during the early 20th century. The case also highlights the difference between procedural justice and perceived justice. Procedural justice refers to the formal application of legal rules, which in this case was followed through multiple trials and sentencing. Perceived justice, however, varies depending on how outcomes are interpreted by different communities. The divergence between these two forms of justice is a central feature of the Massey trial's legacy. In the decades following the case, its significance has remained tied to its role as a historical example of legal complexity in a divided society. It is studied not only as a sequence of criminal proceedings, but as an illustration of how legal systems interact with cultural and social structures. The events surrounding Talia Massey and Joseph Kahahawai continue to be referenced in discussions of justice in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Ultimately, the Massey trial does not conclude with a single interpretive resolution. Instead, it remains a case defined by its multiple outcomes: an unresolved initial trial, a retaliatory act of violence, a subsequent conviction, and a politically modified sentence. Each stage is documented and legally recorded, yet together they produce a narrative that resists simple closure. What endures is not only the record of what happened, but the continued examination of what those events reveal about the structures in which they occurred. The case remains part of the historical fabric of Honolulu, not as an open investigation, but as a completed legal sequence whose meaning continues to be analyzed through the lens of history, law, and society. In the final reflection on the Massey trial of 1931, the case does not end so much as it settles into history with an unresolved weight that continues to define how it is remembered. What occurred in Honolulu was not a single moment of violence or a single courtroom decision, but a chain of events that moved through accusation, doubt, retaliation, judgment, and political intervention. At the center of this chain remained the lives of Talia Massey, Joseph Kahahawai, Thomas Massey, and Grace Fortescue, each positioned differently within a legal and social structure that would ultimately define how their names are remembered. To understand the deeper weight of the case, it is necessary to return to its structure, not as isolated incidents, but as a continuous, unfolding process. The initial allegation made by Talia Massey set everything in motion. It was this claim that brought law enforcement into contact with a group of local men, including Joseph Kahahawai. From the beginning, the case was shaped by instability in evidence and disagreement in interpretation. The legal system attempted to stabilize these uncertainties through trial, but the first courtroom process ended without a unanimous verdict. That moment of judicial incompletion became the first major fracture in the case. A hung jury is not a declaration of innocence or guilt. It is a structural pause in the legal process, where evidence fails to produce consensus. In the Massey case, that pause became socially active rather than neutral. Instead of closing the matter, it intensified the emotional and interpretive divisions surrounding it. For some observers, the lack of conviction suggested failure in prosecution. For others, it suggested that the evidence was insufficient to justify punishment. In either interpretation, the result was instability rather than resolution. That instability is what leads the case into its second and most consequential transformation. The abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai by Thomas Massey, Grace Fortescue, and 2 accomplices was not part of the original judicial process, but it became inseparable from it. It marked a shift from institutional adjudication to personal action. Within the factual record, Kahahawai was forcibly taken, transported, and killed during this incident. His death is not disputed in its occurrence, but its context became central to the legal classification that followed. The second trial did not revisit the original allegation. It did not attempt to relitigate the question of the initial assault claim. Instead, it focused entirely on responsibility for Kahahawai's death. This separation is critical. The court was no longer deciding whether the first accusation was true. It was deciding how to classify the second act of violence. In that sense, the legal system was responding to a new crime that emerged from the unresolved condition of the first. The jury's decision to convict the defendants of manslaughter rather than murder reflects the legal boundaries of interpretation rather than a narrative conclusion. Manslaughter, as a classification, indicates responsibility without the legal threshold of intentional murder as defined by the court. The sentence of 10 years imprisonment reflected the seriousness of that determination within the legal framework of the time. However, the introduction of executive authority by Governor Lawrence M. Judd disrupted the finality of that judgment. The reduction of the sentence to 1 hour fundamentally altered the relationship between conviction and consequence. The legal record remained intact, but its enforcement was effectively removed. This duality, formal guilt paired with minimal punishment, became one of the most defining characteristics of the case's legacy. What makes the Massey trial particularly significant is not only the sequence of events, but the way each stage reveals different pressures acting on the justice system. The first trial exposed evidentiary limits and interpretive disagreement. The second trial demonstrated how legal systems can formally process acts of violence even when those acts are deeply entangled with prior unresolved conflict. The final executive intervention revealed how legal outcomes can be modified outside the courtroom, reshaping the practical meaning of judicial decisions. Across all stages, the individuals involved remain fixed within their roles as defined by the historical record. Talia Massey remains associated with the initiating allegation. Joseph Kahahawai remains the individual whose death marked the transition from disputed accusation to confirmed homicide. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue remain linked to the act that followed the first trial's failure to reach a verdict. These roles do not evolve further because the legal narrative has concluded. What remains is interpretation rather than development. In the broader context of Honolulu during this period, the case reflects structural tensions that extend beyond the individuals involved. The presence of military authority, the influence of social hierarchy, and the division between local and non-local communities all form part of the environment in which the case unfolded. These conditions did not originate from the case, but they shaped how each stage was perceived and experienced. The Massey trial also illustrates a fundamental limitation of legal systems operating under social strain, the gap between procedural resolution and perceived resolution. Procedurally, the case reached completion. Evidence was presented, verdicts were issued, sentences were imposed, and executive authority was exercised. Yet perceived resolution, agreement on meaning, fairness, and justice, was never achieved uniformly across communities. This gap is why the case continues to be studied. It is not because the facts remain unknown, but because the interpretation of those facts remains divided. Legal historians and social analysts return to the case not to uncover hidden information, but to examine how known information can produce radically different conclusions depending on perspective and position. The death of Joseph Kahahawai remains the most irreversible moment in the sequence. It is the point at which legal ambiguity turned into permanent consequence. Yet even this moment did not produce closure because it became embedded in a broader dispute about legitimacy and response. The question of how that death should be understood is inseparable from the conditions that preceded it. Similarly, the initial allegation by Talia Massey cannot be separated from the evidentiary uncertainty that surrounded it. The hung jury represents not just a procedural outcome, but a structural expression of that uncertainty. It is the moment where the system acknowledged its own inability to reach consensus based on available information. The final reduction of sentence by Governor Judd is often seen as the closing action of the case, but it functions more accurately as a reframing of consequences rather than an ending. It does not resolve earlier uncertainties. It overlays them with a new layer of institutional decision-making that further complicates interpretation. When viewed as a whole, the Massey trial becomes less a story of resolution and more a study in accumulation. Each stage adds a new layer of meaning without erasing the previous one. The allegation remains even after the hung jury. The hung jury remains even after the abduction. The abduction remains even after the manslaughter conviction. The conviction remains even after the sentence reduction. Nothing is replaced. Everything is preserved in tension. This accumulation is what gives the case its lasting historical presence. It is not defined by a single outcome, but by the coexistence of multiple outcomes that do not fully reconcile with one another. The legal system produced answers at each stage, but those answers do not converge into a single unified interpretation. In the end, the Massey trial exists as a completed legal sequence and an unfinished social narrative. It is complete in documentation, but open in meaning. It is closed in procedure, but persistent in interpretation. And within that tension, the case continues to function as a reference point for understanding how justice operates under conditions where evidence, identity, and authority do not align cleanly within a single framework. When the Massey trial is examined beyond its surface sequence of events, what emerges is not simply a case of accusation and retaliation, but a layered breakdown of how justice systems behave under conditions of evidentiary uncertainty, social fragmentation, and institutional pressure. The case involving Talia Massey, Joseph Kahahawai, Thomas Massey, and Grace Fortescue in Honolulu is often remembered as a sequence of dramatic legal milestones. But at its core, it is also a procedural case study in how uncertainty propagates through institutions. The first structural layer of the case is evidentiary instability. From the outset, the allegation made by Talia Massey was not supported by consistent or fully corroborated physical evidence. The investigation that followed relied heavily on testimonial interpretation rather than forensic certainty. In modern legal systems, physical evidence often functions as an anchor that stabilizes competing narratives. In this case, that anchor was weak or absent, leaving interpretation as the dominant mechanism of decision-making. This absence of stabilizing evidence had a direct procedural consequence during the first trial. The jury was required to evaluate competing narratives without a definitive evidentiary resolution. The result, a hung jury, should not be understood as procedural failure in a simplistic sense. Instead, it reflects the system operating within its designed limits. A hung jury is the formal acknowledgement that consensus cannot be reached under existing evidentiary conditions. It is not resolution, but structured uncertainty. The second structural layer is escalation through non-judicial action. The abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai represents a critical rupture in the expected legal trajectory. At this point, the case stops being a single judicial matter and becomes a dual-track system, one legal, one extralegal. The legal system continued through prosecution, but the extralegal action introduced a parallel consequence that was not mediated by courts prior to its occurrence. This dual-track structure is essential to understanding the uniqueness of the Massey case. In most criminal processes, unresolved legal outcomes remain within institutional boundaries. Here, the unresolved outcome of the first trial became the direct catalyst for a separate act of violence. This transition demonstrates how legal uncertainty can migrate outward into social and personal decision-making when institutional closure is not achieved. The third structural layer is classification ambiguity. During the second trial, the court was not evaluating whether Kahahawai had been killed. That fact was established. Instead, it was required to classify intent within a legal framework that distinguishes murder from manslaughter. This distinction is not purely factual. It is interpretive. It depends on how intent, circumstance, and responsibility are legally weighted. The jury's decision to convict for manslaughter reflects this interpretive boundary. It indicates recognition of responsibility, but not full alignment with the legal definition of intentional murder. This is where legal systems often reveal their most complex function, translating continuous human behavior into discrete categories of culpability. The fourth structural layer is institutional override. The sentence reduction by Governor Lawrence M. Judd introduces a second authority layer above judicial outcome. This is not a reversal of the verdict, but a modification of its consequence. The legal system produced one outcome. The executive system altered its effect. This creates a separation between symbolic justice, the conviction, and applied justice, the punishment. This separation is crucial in analyzing systemic perception. A justice system derives legitimacy not only from its ability to produce verdicts, but from the perceived alignment between verdicts and consequences. When those two elements diverge significantly, institutional trust becomes unstable. The fifth structural layer is social interpretation divergence. In Honolulu at the time, the case did not exist in a unified interpretive space. Instead, it existed across multiple social frameworks that interpreted the same events differently. For some, the case represented failure of legal protection in the initial allegation. For others, it represented failure of proportional justice in the response to Kahahawai's death. These interpretations were not reconcilable within the legal process itself. The individuals at the center of the case became symbolic nodes within this interpretive divergence. Talia Massey became associated with vulnerability and contested testimony. Joseph Kahahawai became associated with both accusation and victimhood, depending on interpretive frame. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue became associated with extrajudicial escalation and its legal consequences. The sixth structural layer is institutional memory formation. Once the case concluded procedurally, it did not disappear from institutional awareness. Instead, it transitioned into a reference case for legal, historical, and sociological analysis. This is a common endpoint for cases that involve both legal complexity and social tension. They become examples used to study system behavior rather than isolated incidents. In this phase, the Massey trial is no longer treated as a single narrative, but as a composite model. Each phase of the case is extracted and analyzed independently. Evidentiary failure, jury deadlock, extrajudicial escalation, classification of intent, and executive intervention. These components are then used to understand how similar conditions might produce similar outcomes in other contexts. The seventh structural layer is moral fragmentation. Unlike legal classification, moral interpretation does not converge on formal definitions. It operates through emotional, cultural, and historical frameworks. The Massey case resists moral consolidation because each stage produces a different moral focal point. The initial allegation raises questions of victim credibility. The hung jury raises questions of evidentiary sufficiency. The killing raises questions of retaliation. The sentence reduction raises questions of institutional equity. These moral layers do not replace one another. They coexist, often in contradiction. The eighth structural layer is historical persistence. Even after legal closure, cases like this persist because they are structurally useful for understanding systemic tension. The Massey trial continues to be referenced not because it is unresolved legally, but because it is unresolved interpretively. It functions as a case study in how justice systems behave when multiple pressures converge simultaneously. In synthesis, the Massey trial is not defined by any single outcome, but by the interaction of all outcomes across time. It demonstrates that legal systems are not linear resolution machines, but layered interpretive structures that can produce multiple valid yet conflicting results within the same procedural framework. The final understanding of the case is therefore not closure, but structural awareness. It is the recognition that in Honolulu during this period, law, society, and authority were not operating in isolation but in constant interaction, and that interaction produced a case whose meaning remains permanently distributed across its many unresolved dimensions. In the decades following the conclusion of the Massey trial in Honolulu, the case gradually transitioned from an active legal controversy into a structured reference point within legal history, academic discussion, and institutional analysis. What had once been a sequence of urgent courtroom proceedings involving Talia Massey, Joseph Kahahawai, Thomas Massey, and Grace Fortescue became, over time, a case study used to examine how justice systems operate under conditions of social strain, evidentiary uncertainty, and institutional hierarchy. In legal scholarship, the case is frequently referenced not for its procedural novelty, but for the way it demonstrates structural tension between formal justice mechanisms and social context. The initial trial, which ended in a hung jury, is often analyzed as an example of evidentiary insufficiency meeting interpretive division. In this framing, the jury's inability to reach a unanimous verdict is not treated as a failure of the system, but as an expression of its boundaries. Legal systems require a threshold of certainty to produce conviction, and when that threshold cannot be reached, the system must formally acknowledge unresolved ambiguity. This moment of unresolved ambiguity is one of the key reasons the case continues to appear in legal education discussions. It illustrates how criminal proceedings can reach procedural completion without producing substantive closure. In the Massey case, that unresolved state did not remain static. It became a catalyst for subsequent actions outside the judicial framework, which later re-entered the legal system in the form of a separate homicide trial. This progression is often used in academic settings to demonstrate how unresolved legal outcomes can influence behavior beyond institutional boundaries. The second major phase of the case, involving the death of Joseph Kahahawai, is analyzed in legal studies as a transition point between contested accusation and confirmed criminal liability. The facts of the abduction and killing were established in court, and the legal system shifted its focus from determining whether a crime occurred to determining how that crime should be classified. The distinction between murder and manslaughter in this context is often used to illustrate how legal categories depend not only on factual evidence, but also on interpretive thresholds of intent. The conviction of Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue, along with their accomplices, for manslaughter is typically examined as an example of how courts differentiate degrees of culpability even when the core sequence of events is not in dispute. In legal analysis, this phase of the case is important because it demonstrates that even when factual clarity exists, legal interpretation remains complex and subject to jury assessment. However, the legal narrative does not end with the conviction. The intervention by Governor Lawrence M. Judd, who reduced the sentence from 10 years to 1 hour, introduces a second institutional layer into the case. In legal and political studies, this moment is frequently cited when discussing the relationship between judicial authority and executive power. The governor's action did not overturn the conviction itself, but it fundamentally altered the enforcement of the sentence. This distinction is crucial in understanding how different branches of authority can produce competing outcomes within the same case. In academic analysis, this intervention is often used to explore the concept of formal justice versus practical justice. Formal justice refers to the outcome recorded in legal systems, verdicts, convictions, and sentences. Practical justice refers to the lived consequence of those outcomes. In the Massey case, the divergence between these two forms of justice becomes a central point of discussion. The conviction remained on record, but the punishment was effectively neutralized in practice. This divergence continues to be studied as an example of how institutional authority can reshape legal meaning without altering legal text. Beyond legal scholarship, the case is also studied in broader sociopolitical contexts. In discussions of territorial governance in Hawaii during the early 20th century, the Massey trial is often cited as an example of how legal systems function within layered social hierarchies. The presence of military influence, colonial administrative structure, and local population dynamics created a complex environment in which legal outcomes were interpreted differently across communities. In this context, the case is not analyzed solely as a criminal matter, but as a reflection of structural inequality and institutional response. The differing perceptions of justice among various groups in Hawaii at the time are frequently referenced in sociological studies. Some interpretations emphasize the initial failure to secure a conviction in the first trial, while others emphasize the later reduction of sentence in the second trial. These perspectives are not reconciled within the case itself, which is why it continues to be studied as an example of interpretive divergence in legal systems. The individuals involved remain central to these discussions, not as evolving participants, but as fixed reference points within the historical record. Talia Massey is often discussed in relation to how allegations are processed within systems that rely heavily on testimonial evidence. Joseph Kahahawai is referenced in discussions of how accused individuals can become victims of extrajudicial escalation when legal outcomes remain unresolved. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue are frequently examined in studies of how social status intersects with legal accountability. In media studies, the case is also significant for how it demonstrates the role of public narrative formation in shaping legal perception. Although the case occurred in the early 20th century before modern digital media, it was widely reported and discussed in national outlets of the time. This coverage contributed to the formation of competing narratives that influenced how the case was understood both locally and nationally. The divergence between these narratives is often analyzed as an early example of how media framing can affect public interpretation of legal events. Over time, the Massey trial has also become a reference point in discussions of legal ethics and institutional trust. It is used to illustrate how confidence in legal systems can be affected when outcomes appear inconsistent or influenced by external authority. The combination of a hung jury, a subsequent extrajudicial killing, a manslaughter conviction, and a drastically reduced sentence creates a layered sequence that is difficult to interpret through a single ethical framework. In legal education, the case is often presented not as a model of procedural failure, but as a demonstration of systemic complexity. It shows how law operates under conditions where evidence is incomplete, social pressure is high, and institutional authority is distributed across multiple branches of governance. Students of law and history examine the case to understand how these factors interact rather than to derive a singular conclusion. Ultimately, the cultural and legal legacy of the Massey trial is defined by its resistance to simplification. The case does not resolve neatly into categories of guilt or innocence, justice or injustice, success or failure. Instead, it exists as a structured example of how legal systems process conflict in environments where social, political, and evidentiary forces do not align cleanly. Within the historical memory of Honolulu, the case remains embedded as a reference point for discussions of justice and authority. It continues to be analyzed not because it is unresolved in a legal sense, but because it remains unresolved in interpretive meaning. And in that persistence of interpretation, the Massey trial maintains its place as one of the most studied and contested legal events in Hawaiian history. When the Massey trial is examined as a complete historical system, it ceases to function as a linear narrative of crime and punishment and instead reveals itself as a compressed model of institutional pressure. The case involving Talia Massey, Joseph Kahahawai, Thomas Massey, and Grace Fortescue in Honolulu is not defined by any single legal decision, but by the cumulative interaction of multiple legal failures, partial resolutions, and authority overrides. At the structural level, the case demonstrates how justice systems behave when three conditions occur simultaneously: evidentiary uncertainty, social polarization, and institutional fragmentation. Each of these conditions alone is manageable within a legal framework. When combined, They produce outcomes that are legally valid but socially unstable. The first condition, evidentiary uncertainty, was present from the outset. The initial allegation made by Talia Massey entered the legal system without the level of physical corroboration that would normally stabilize criminal proceedings. In such cases, legal systems rely heavily on procedural mechanisms such as cross-examination, witness consistency, and jury interpretation. However, these mechanisms are designed to evaluate evidence, not to create it. When evidence is incomplete or inconsistent, the system can only operate within the limits of interpretation. The hung jury in the first trial is therefore not an anomaly, but a structural outcome. It reflects the point at which interpretive capacity reaches its threshold. In legal theory, this moment is critical because it marks the boundary between adjudication and uncertainty. The system does not fail, it pauses. The second condition, social polarization, determined what happened next. The unresolved state of the first trial did not remain contained within the courtroom. Instead, it extended into social perception, where different communities interpreted the absence of a verdict in fundamentally different ways. In polarized environments, legal ambiguity does not remain neutral. It becomes a catalyst for alternative forms of resolution outside institutional boundaries. This is the context in which the abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai occurred. The act itself is legally separate from the original allegation, but structurally connected to its unresolved outcome. The transition from judicial process to extrajudicial action is one of the most significant structural ruptures in the case. It demonstrates how legal incompletion can generate behavioral responses that bypass formal systems entirely. The third condition, institutional fragmentation, becomes most visible in the final phase of the case. After the second trial resulted in a manslaughter conviction, the intervention by Governor Lawrence M. Judd introduced a separate authority layer into the outcome structure. The judiciary produced one result, conviction and sentencing. The executive branch produced another, sentence reduction. Both outcomes are legally valid within their respective domains, yet they conflict in practical effect. This fragmentation is not unique to the Massey trial, but the case illustrates it with unusual clarity. When multiple branches of authority can independently alter the meaning of a single event, legal coherence becomes distributed rather than unified. The result is a system where truth is not singular but layered across institutional roles. From a systemic perspective, the Massey trial can be understood as a sequence of transformations in the meaning of evidence. At the beginning, evidence is incomplete and contested. During the first trial, it is insufficient to produce consensus. After the extrajudicial escalation, evidence becomes irrelevant to the initial question and instead becomes part of a new legal inquiry. During the second trial, evidence is sufficient to establish action but insufficient to unify interpretation of intent. Finally, in the sentencing phase, evidence becomes secondary to institutional discretion. This shifting role of evidence is central to understanding why the case remains historically significant. It demonstrates that evidence does not function independently. It operates within institutional frameworks that determine how it is interpreted and applied. The individuals involved in the case become, in this structural reading, fixed reference points within a dynamic system. Talia Massey represents the initiating claim that enters the system. Joseph Kahahawai represents the transition from accusation to consequence. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue represent the point at which legal frustration transforms into extrajudicial action and then re-enters the legal system through prosecution. These roles are not moral assignments, they are structural positions within a sequence. In systemic analysis, individuals are not interpreted primarily through intent, but through function within procedural transitions. Another key dimension of the case is temporal compression. The entire sequence, from allegation to final sentence reduction, occurs within a relatively short span of time, yet it contains multiple full cycles of legal processing. In systems theory, this is significant because it increases the intensity of each decision point. When multiple legal phases occur in rapid succession, each phase carries amplified consequences for the next. The Massey trial also demonstrates how legal systems respond when internal resolution fails to align with external expectations. The first trial fails to produce a verdict. The second trial produces a verdict that is later effectively neutralized in consequence. This misalignment between expectation, outcome, and enforcement creates a feedback loop that extends the case beyond its procedural boundaries. In historical analysis, the case is often used to illustrate how justice systems operate under conditions of colonial governance structures. In such systems, legal authority is not centralized in a single cultural or institutional framework. Instead, it is distributed across overlapping jurisdictions and social hierarchies. This distribution creates conditions where legal outcomes are not interpreted uniformly across populations. Within Honolulu, this distribution of authority played a significant role in shaping how each stage of the case was received. The legal system functioned formally, but its legitimacy was interpreted differently depending on social position, community affiliation, and institutional proximity. The final systemic insight of the Massey trial is that it does not conclude with resolution, but with stabilization of contradiction. The legal system produces a conviction. The executive system reduces its consequence. The social system remains divided in interpretation. All three systems stabilize independently, without converging into a single narrative. This is why the case continues to appear in legal and historical discourse. It is not preserved because it is unresolved in fact, but because it is unresolved in structure. It contains multiple valid outcomes that cannot be fully reconciled into one interpretive framework. In the end, the Massey trial functions as a compressed model of justice under strain, a system where evidence is insufficient, interpretation is divided, authority is layered, and outcomes are formally complete but socially fragmented. It remains one of the clearest examples of how legal systems can reach closure in procedure while remaining open in meaning. In the decades after the legal conclusion of the Massey trial in Honolulu, the case involving Talia Massey, Joseph Kahahawai, Thomas Massey, and Grace Fortescue ceased to exist as an active judicial matter and instead became an archival object. At this stage, the case is no longer defined by courtroom proceedings or immediate public reaction, but by how its records were preserved, categorized, and interpreted within institutional archives. The transformation from active case to archival record is a critical shift in legal history. Once proceedings are closed, the primary sources of truth are no longer testimonies heard in court, but documents, transcripts, police reports, sentencing records, and executive orders. Each of these records represents a fragment of the total narrative, but none of them alone contains the complete interpretive structure of the case. In the archival record of the Massey trial, the earliest documents begin with the initial complaint filed by Talia Massey. This document, like many initial police reports of the era, reflects the first formal translation of a personal allegation into institutional language. It marks the entry point of the case into the legal system. In archival analysis, this document is often treated not as a conclusion of truth, but as the beginning of institutional framing. The wording, structure, and categorization of such reports influence how subsequent investigative steps are recorded and interpreted. Following this, the arrest records of multiple suspects, including Joseph Kahahawai, form the next major archival layer. These documents are typically examined in legal history not only for their content, but for what they reveal about procedural priorities at the time. Arrest records capture the moment when suspicion becomes formalized into custody, but they do not resolve evidentiary uncertainty. In archival terms, they represent procedural escalation without adjudication. The next layer in the archival structure is the trial transcript from the first court proceedings. This is one of the most heavily analyzed components of the entire case. Transcripts preserve the exact language used by witnesses, attorneys, and judges, but they also reveal the limitations of courtroom truth. In the Massey trial, the transcript reflects conflicting testimony and evidentiary gaps that ultimately contributed to the hung jury outcome. Archival researchers often emphasize that transcripts are not neutral recordings of truth, but structure representations shaped by questioning strategy, legal procedure, and courtroom dynamics. The hung jury itself is recorded in a separate procedural document. This record is brief, but its significance is substantial. In archival interpretation, it represents the formal recognition of unresolved evidentiary conflict. Unlike verdicts of guilt or innocence, a hung jury is not a statement of fact but a statement of inability. It is one of the few legal outcomes that explicitly records the limits of consensus. The archival trail then shifts dramatically with the documentation of the abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai. Police reports, witness statements, and forensic documentation collectively reconstruct the sequence of events in which Kahahawai was taken and killed. These records are distinct from the earlier trial materials because they describe a completed act of violence rather than an alleged one. In archival classification, this shift is often described as a transition from contested allegation to confirmed homicide documentation. The forensic reports, in particular, are significant in the archival structure. They provide physical documentation of cause of death and location of discovery. However, even these records are interpreted within institutional frameworks that determine how forensic findings are categorized in relation to legal charges. The presence of physical evidence does not automatically resolve interpretive questions about intent or classification. The subsequent trial records form another distinct archival layer. These include indictments, courtroom transcripts, jury instructions, and sentencing documents related to Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue. In archival systems, this trial is often indexed separately from the first, despite being part of a continuous narrative sequence. This separation reflects how legal archives prioritize case categorization based on charge type rather than narrative continuity. Within these documents, the manslaughter conviction is recorded as the formal legal conclusion of criminal responsibility. However, archival interpretation emphasizes that the classification of manslaughter versus murder is not merely descriptive, but interpretive within legal frameworks. The sentencing document, which originally imposed a 10-year term, is another key archival artifact, representing the judiciary's formal assignment of consequence. One of the most unusual and frequently cited documents in the archival record is the executive order reducing the sentence issued by Governor Lawrence M. Judd. This document is often stored separately from judicial records because it originates from executive authority rather than the court system. In archival theory, this separation highlights the multi-source nature of legal truth. Judicial records, forensic records, and executive records coexist, but are not hierarchically unified. The reduction of the sentence to 1 hour is preserved in archival form as a modification record rather than a reversal. This distinction is important because it demonstrates how archival systems preserve original judgments even when their consequences are altered. The conviction remains intact in the record, while the punishment record reflects executive intervention. When historians and legal scholars examine the Massey trial archive as a whole, they encounter a fragmented structure rather than a single coherent narrative. Each document type belongs to a different institutional logic. Police reports belong to investigative logic. Court transcripts belong to adversarial logic. Jury outcomes belong to deliberative logic. Executive orders belong to administrative logic. These logics do not merge automatically. They coexist in parallel. This fragmentation is central to understanding why the case continues to be studied. It is not because any single document is incomplete, but because no single document can represent the entire system of events. The archival record forces interpretation across boundaries of institutional function. In the case of Talia Massey, the archival record shows a progression from complainant to central figure in a broader legal sequence. In the case of Joseph Kahahawai, the record shifts from accused individual to documented homicide victim. In the case of Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue, the archival material reflects movement from defendants to convicted individuals whose sentences were subsequently altered by executive authority. Each of these transitions is preserved in separate documentary layers, which is why archival analysis is essential to understanding the full case. Without archival synthesis, the Massey trial would appear as disconnected legal episodes rather than a continuous structural sequence. Another important aspect of the archival record is absence. Not all elements of the case are equally documented. Certain contextual details that would have influenced perception at the time are not preserved in formal legal archives. This absence is itself a subject of scholarly attention. Archival gaps do not indicate irrelevance. They indicate the limits of institutional recording practices in the early 20th century. In modern legal historiography, the Massey trial is often used as an example of how archival systems shape historical understanding. What is preserved determines what can be studied. What is not preserved determines what must be inferred or left unresolved. The case therefore exists not only as a historical event, but as a product of archival selection and preservation. Ultimately, the archival dossier of the Massey trial does not resolve the case into a single interpretation. Instead, it preserves its structural complexity across multiple documentary layers. The result is a case that is fully recorded but not fully unified, fully documented but not fully harmonized. And within that fragmentation, the Massey trial continues to exist as a reference point for understanding how legal systems preserve, organize, and ultimately transmit the memory of contested justice in Honolulu. In the formal structure of legal history, the Massey trial in Honolulu is classified as a closed case. The proceedings ended, verdicts were issued, sentences were recorded, and executive intervention was applied. In institutional terms, the file is complete. Yet in analytical and cultural terms, the case involving Talia Massey, Joseph Kahahawai, Thomas Massey, and Grace Fortescue remains structurally open. This contradiction between procedural closure and interpretive continuation is the defining characteristic of what scholars often describe as silent cases. These are cases that no longer exist in active legal systems but continue to operate within historical, ethical, and institutional discourse because their meaning cannot be fully stabilized. The concept of silence in legal archives does not refer to absence of information. On the contrary, the Massey trial is extensively documented across police records, courtroom transcripts, forensic reports, sentencing documents, and executive orders. Silence, in this context, refers to the absence of a single authoritative narrative that can unify those records into a consistent interpretive whole. The first layer of this silence emerges from evidentiary structure. The initial allegation by Talia Massey entered the legal system in a form that required interpretation from the beginning. The absence of fully stabilizing physical evidence meant that the case depended heavily on testimonial coherence and institutional interpretation. Even at the earliest stage, the system was not resolving facts in isolation but constructing a legal narrative from incomplete fragments. When the first trial resulted in a hung jury, that moment became the first formal expression of interpretive silence. A hung jury does not declare innocence or guilt. It declares the inability of collective reasoning to converge on certainty. In legal systems, this is not an anomaly, but a structural boundary condition. It marks the point where institutional language can no longer compress ambiguity into decision. The second layer of silence appears after the escalation of the case into extrajudicial action. The abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai created a rupture in procedural continuity. At that moment, the legal system was no longer the only mechanism processing the case. Action had moved outside institutional adjudication, and when it returned to the courtroom, it did so in a transformed context. The manslaughter conviction of Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue represents a legal reabsorption of that rupture. The court was no longer evaluating allegation but consequence. However, even this phase did not restore narrative unity. Instead, it produced another interpretive split, the distinction between legal classification and moral interpretation. The third layer of silence emerges in the gap between conviction and sentence modification. The judicial system established responsibility and punishment. The executive system altered the lived consequence of that punishment. Governor Lawrence M. Judd's decision to reduce the sentence did not erase the conviction, but it redefined its practical weight. In archival terms, this creates a dual record, one legal, one administrative, neither fully dominant over the other. This duality is critical to understanding why the case resists closure. In stable legal narratives, verdict and consequence align in a linear relationship. In the Massey trial, that alignment is broken. The record shows guilt without sustained penalty, legal conclusion without proportional continuity. This structural mismatch becomes one of the core reasons the case persists in historical discourse. As time passes, silence begins to operate differently. It is no longer the silence of missing evidence or unresolved verdicts. It becomes the silence of saturation. The case is not underdocumented. It is overdocumented. Yet no amount of documentation produces convergence. Police reports, trial transcripts, forensic findings, and executive records all exist simultaneously, but they do not resolve into a single interpretive axis. This is where the case becomes analytically significant in legal history. It demonstrates that documentation alone does not guarantee narrative resolution. Information density and interpretive coherence are not the same thing. A case can be fully recorded and still fundamentally unresolved in meaning. In the decades following the case, scholarly interpretation of events in Talia Massey's allegation, the death of Joseph Kahahawai, and the legal consequences faced by Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue has shifted repeatedly, depending on analytical framework. Legal scholars focus on procedural breakdown. Sociologists focus on structural inequality. Historians focus on institutional context. Each discipline extracts a different version of the same sequence. What remains consistent across all interpretations is fragmentation. No disciplinary lens fully absorbs the case. Instead, each produces a partial reconstruction that highlights certain dimensions while leaving others in shadow. This multiplicity of valid but incomplete interpretations is what sustains the case's presence in academic discourse. Another form of silence appears in the relationship between public memory and institutional record. Official archives preserve structured legal documentation, but public memory operates differently. It selects, compresses, and re-narrates events into simplified moral or symbolic forms. Over time, the Massey trial becomes less a sequence of legal events and more a reference point for broader themes: justice, authority, conflict, and institutional legitimacy. In this transformation, specific procedural details fade while structural interpretations intensify. The case becomes less about what happened in sequence and more about what it represents in principle. This shift is not unique to this case, but the Massey trial illustrates it with particular clarity because of the intensity of its procedural fragmentation. The silence, therefore, is not emptiness. It is the space created when multiple systems of interpretation operate simultaneously, without convergence. Legal systems, archival systems, and cultural memory systems all continue to process the case, but none of them produce a final synthesis. In Honolulu, the case remains embedded in historical consciousness, not as an open legal matter, but as an example of how closure in law does not necessarily produce closure in meaning. It exists as a completed file and an uncompleted narrative at the same time. This dual existence is what gives the Massey trial its enduring analytical weight. It is not remembered because it is unresolved in court, but because it is unresolved in structure. The legal system completed its function, yet the interpretive system did not converge. And so the final insight of the case is not a fact, verdict, or sentence, but a condition that some cases, once processed through all available institutions of justice, continue to exist as unresolved objects of interpretation. Not because they are incomplete, but because completion in law does not equate to completion in meaning. The Massey trial ends in record, but it continues in silence. Every true crime case has two endings. The first is the legal ending, when court stops speaking. The second is the narrative ending, when people stop asking questions. In the Massey trial in Honolulu, involving Talia Massey, Joseph Kahahawai, Thomas Massey, and Grace Fortescue, those two endings never fully aligned. The legal system ended the case through verdicts, sentencing, and executive reduction of punishment. On paper, the process reached completion. Every procedural requirement was met. Every institutional role was executed. The system did what it was designed to do. It processed events into legal outcomes. But narrative closure operates differently. It does not ask whether a file is closed. It asks whether the meaning has settled. In this case, meaning never settled. The first reason is structural. The initial allegation entered the system without the kind of evidentiary certainty that allows narratives to stabilize early. From that point forward, every stage of the case inherited ambiguity. The hung jury did not resolve that ambiguity. It formalized it. The second reason is sequential rupture. The death of Joseph Kahahawai did not resolve the uncertainty of the first trial. It transformed it. Instead of closure, the system experienced escalation. The case stopped being one legal question and became two incompatible ones: the question of the original allegation and the question of retaliatory violence. The third reason is institutional divergence. The manslaughter conviction of Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue created legal conclusion, but the sentence reduction by Governor Lawrence M. Judd created interpretive reversal of consequence. One system affirmed punishment. Another minimized it. Both outcomes coexist in the record without reconciliation. This is where the case becomes permanently static in motion. It does not continue forward, but it also does not collapse into a single meaning. Instead, it freezes at the point where systems disagree. In most historical cases, time smooths this contradiction. Records fade, interpretations simplify, and events are absorbed into stable narratives. But the Massey trial resists that smoothing process because its structure contains too many unresolved junctions. Each figure in the case remains locked in a specific structural position. Talia Massey remains the initiating point of contested testimony. Joseph Kahahawai remains the unresolved center of both accusation and victimhood. Thomas Massey and Grace Fortescue remain fixed at the intersection of conviction and mitigation. These positions do not evolve anymore. They only persist. And persistence is the final stage of this case. Because what makes the Massey trial historically significant is not what it reveals about a single crime, but what it reveals about systems under pressure. It shows how legal institutions behave when evidence is unstable, how social systems behave when trust breaks, and how political systems behave when verdicts are not enough to stabilize public interpretation. The result is not resolution. It is layering. A legal layer that says the case is closed. A historical layer that keeps interpreting it. A cultural layer that keeps reframing it. And an archival layer that keeps preserving contradictions without resolving them. When these layers overlap, they do not cancel each other out. They accumulate. That accumulation is why the case still exists in discussion decades later, not as an active investigation, but as a structural example of how justice systems can complete all procedures and still fail to produce a unified meaning. So the final truth of the Massey trial is not found in any verdict, sentence, or archival file. It is found in the gap between them. A gap that no court can close. A gap that no archive can unify. A gap that only interpretation can circle, but never fill. And that is where the case ends. Not with silence. Not with resolution. But with permanence in contradiction.